Going to be in Matthew chapter 10 this evening, looking at some statements that Jesus made to his apostles as he commissioned them to really, in many ways, as we think about the parable that Jesus taught of the man who was hiring different people to come in and work in his field. Remember how he hired people at different times of the day. And there were those who got hired because of the time they got hired. They bore the heat of the sun. And they were out there a lot longer than some people who got hired at the end of the day. And there was a little bit of turmoil because everybody got paid the same amount of money. And remember, there was a little bit of some kind of snipping back and forth about that. And every time I think about that particular parable, it is kind of interesting. You know, we're going to get the same reward that the apostles had. And in many ways, they bore the heat of the labor. They went through the intense persecution that we've never really had to go through. In many ways, some of the other early disciples bore intense persecution on behalf of furthering the gospel. And it is kind of amazing when you think about the fact that they're not going to get a better reward. We're really all getting the same reward, no matter what time someone decides to serve, through the amazing grace that God blesses us all that way. But also in many ways, I think for me, it kind of challenges us to try to do as much as we possibly can to at least live up to the kind of dedication and the kind of work ethic and the sacrifices that they were willing to make, that we might even feel at least able to stand maybe perhaps in their presence if we're so blessed to be able to all be together in heaven one of these days, and to truly feel like we've just given our all. And this is a great chapter to encourage us not only to think about certainly the challenges that we often face, but also the great reward that there is for us in simply doing what God commissions us to do in a hostile environment. But there in Matthew chapter 10, I want to read a few things that Jesus says as he picked his disciples, his apostles. But notice he says in verse 1, Matthew chapter 10, verse 1, he says, Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. Now, the names of the 12 apostles are these. The first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, and James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. And here he commissions them to do the work that he appointed them to do. In verse 5 it says, These 12 Jesus sent out after instructing them, Do not go in the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter any city of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach, saying, The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. Freely you receive, freely give. Do not acquire gold or silver or copper for your money belts, or a bag for your journey, or even 2 coats or sandals or staff, for the worker is worthy of his support. And whatever city or village you enter, inquire who is worthy in it, and stay at his house until you leave that city. As you enter the house, give it your greeting. If the house is worthy, give it your blessing of peace. But if it is not worthy, take back your blessing of peace. Whoever does not receive you, nor heed your words as you go out of that house or city, shake the dust off your feet. Truly I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. I think anytime anybody's sent on a mission, sent on a journey, sent on a mission with great, grand importance to it, always kind of the sense of adventure to it, right? You know, a sense of excitement. And then no doubt there's always that sense of adventure and excitement with something positive, something truly amazing as the message of the kingdom, of receiving all the spiritual blessings that Jesus wants us to be reunited with our Father, and to have so much greater riches and greater blessings than anything this temporary life can offer. But yet with that excitement, with that sense of adventure, Jesus does paint a very realistic element of what that experience was like. It really was not the adventure theme or experience. It was incredibly difficult, incredibly hostile towards them. And he warns them about this. Notice what he says in verse 16. He says, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. But beware of men, for they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues. And you will even be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. But when they hand you over, do not worry about how or what you are to say, for it will be given you in that hour what you are to say. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Spirit of your Father speaks in you." And I just want to focus on that statement. He gives them the realistic temperature of what that experience was going to be like. Incredibly hostile. Intensely hostile. I'm sending you like sheep in the midst of wolves. You're going to be basically laid open and really exposed. And in your humble sense of innocence, pleading for people out of a sense of love and duty and devotion to a holy God, there's going to be this dismissive sense of antagonism against you and harsh persecution. I don't want you to retaliate. Rather, I want you to suffer and to depend on God in those moments and keep preaching. And they faithfully did that. And it's amazing to me because I find it greatly encouraging to look at their experience. Because in many ways, this is very true for us today. The climate is really no different. It may be more extreme in certain parts of the world, obviously, but mankind's response to the gospel is initially the same. And unfortunately, a lot of the times, the initial response is antagonistic, hostile, harsh words of persecution against us, a sense of wanting to do away with us or even make our lives as difficult as possible because we are bringing this message and they feel a sense of conviction and they don't want to feel that, they don't want to change their ways, they don't even want to contemplate thinking about a different life than they've already set up for themselves. And that in and of itself brings a sense of how dare you? How dare you try to be holier than thou and give me a message that says that I'm wrong or that there's something about my life that's not approved unto God. And again, even while we come out as sheep, innocent, not antagonistic, not seeking to cause problems, but seeking to relieve people from their problems, but oftentimes they receive it that way. And I think it's a great statement that the way that Jesus encouraged the apostles to go through that, we can use these same words of encouragement and guidance. I think they're just as applicable to us as they were for the apostles. Let's just go through these very quickly and notice that. So again, the first point, just want to make aware for us, we also are going through a hostile territory. In what sense does he encourage us to think about how we approach this? He says, because of the hostility, because of the atmosphere of negativity, of resistance, of feeling threatened by our message, he says, let us be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. In other words, let us not just throw ourselves willingly into hostile situations or territory, but let us kind of feel our situation out. In other words, just as a serpent would wisely kind of maneuver itself in finding the safe place of passage and not just throwing itself out and being vulnerable all the time, would use tactic maneuver or would show some sense of wisdom and some sense of caution. Jesus really expressed that in Matthew chapter 7. If you turn over to Matthew chapter 7, remember Jesus said, just don't willy-nilly, just go ahead and just kind of lay out the whole message to anybody we meet. In other words, we kind of just as we fish for men, fish for interest. There's certain people that are just obviously just so hostile towards it that you're just kind of casting your pearls before swine in some instances. You don't just go ahead and throw yourself out to the wolves to just be shredded and just be laid bare before them. Notice what he says in Matthew chapter 7 about this in verse 6. He says, do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. So in other words, even in this hostile environment, we do have to have some tact, some wisdom, kind of fish for a little bit of that interest. As we talk to individuals, some people come right out and you just know, I don't know what good is going to come of maybe trying to be argumentative or really trying to push this on somebody. It's just going to turn into something where they're going to tear me apart. They're going to use it against me and make my life a bit extra miserable. You're going to have that regardless. You're going to have some elements of that. So don't just walk willy-nilly just right into hostile environments and just leave yourself open to just exposure. But kind of test the waters, so to speak. Look for interest. Look for curious individuals who might already be questioning. That being said, it still is not going to make the persecution go away. In other words, he says, the persecution is going to be inevitable. But what we should do is try to have that courage as while we are seeking to find those interested individuals, recognize that we are going to have to lay it open and lay it bare, and we cannot hide it or soft soap it. Once we do find those individuals that are willing to hear the message, we have to be clearly open about it and lay the whole thing out for all of them to hear. And eventually others who are hostile, they'll get wind of it, and they'll cause their own trouble. Notice in many ways this is kind of what Jesus meant when he said in verse 26. Turn to Matthew chapter 10 in verse 26. He says, "Therefore do not fear them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. What I tell you in the darkness, speak in the light. And what you hear whispered in your ear, proclaim upon the housetops." In other words, once you have found that good ground or found that open ear, that willing heart to hear it, don't hold back. Lay the whole thing out. Even at the risk of others who may, you recognize, maybe these aren't the ones who maybe are open to hear this message. They're going to catch wind. They see interest and they see maybe a public forum of discussion. You openly answering their questions, openly teaching them. They openly trying to see, implement some changes in their life, only to find those outsiders, those individuals who are hostile, bringing their attack, bringing their hostility, bringing all the opposition. In other words, it's inevitable. In other words, what he's saying is, while we can try to limit it as much as possible, or not just throw ourselves open to it, inevitably there will be hostility. We have to expect that. We have to anticipate that. Even while there are ways that we can gauge it, let us not be so ashamed of the gospel that we do have an opportunity to preach it. Let's not fear the initial antagonistic responses of the outsiders who will inevitably see that something fishy is going on and they don't like it. They don't like their coworkers suddenly changing. They don't like their family member suddenly changing. They don't like their friend from way back when suddenly changing their views. And there will be those who will make their opposition known. And essentially those who are bringing that message will be the ones subject to it. So notice what he says as he continues this. And notice verses 21 through 22. He says, even as you try to maneuver, show some tactic, test the waters, be prepared for the onslaught of negativity. It's going to come. And in that sense, he says, in fact, you can't run away from it. You cannot hide from it. In verses 21 through 22, he makes that point. He says, brother will betray brother to death, father his child. Children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. You will be hated by all because of my name. But it is the one who has endured to the end who will be saved. In other words, while we can try to minimize the impact initially, we cannot stop it. Inevitably, initially, it will come in various forms. And we are going to be hated in this nation. I think one specific example, and I just feel so badly for what she went through, but I'm also encouraged by her stand and her courage. There was a young lady in high school, young Christian girl. She had been a Christian for several years. I think it might be junior high school she became a Christian. And in her, I believe it was her junior, maybe senior year of high school, they had what was called Pride Week. and it was to celebrate and rejoice that all those who were openly gay or homosexual were able to practice that and not be afraid of any opposition to it. And so all the students were encouraged to wear something that would show either a rainbow-colored outfit or shirt showing your support. This girl did not say anything antagonistic against that cause. All she did was decide not to wear a shirt in support of it. She lost all of her friends. She was viciously bullied and became the target for the rest of her scholastic career. This is what Jesus is setting us up for. We are in hostile territory. Even when we gently, as we suggest, don't just throw yourself out into the wolves, but even when you do take your stance and you try to set the tone for the gospel message, and even showing that there is forgiveness, that there is mercy, that there is grace, no matter what the sin is, but also taking a stand that essentially we are talking about changing towards a system of righteousness. And simply deciding that they were not going to participate in that, they became the target of that sense of persecution. And the disciples and the apostles were targets, and essentially what he's telling us is, let us be prepared for that. In other words, sometimes what happens is, knowing this or realizing that there is potential for this, we can often just put our light under the bushel in that children's song that we were told not to do. It's very easy to do that. Almost trying to minimize that persecution. And then again, notice the balance. Jesus says, now you can gauge it. You can kind of choose cautiously and carefully, but at the same time, you have to eventually say the message. You have to spill your beans. You have to let the whole truth out. You can't hide it. And knowing that there's going to be that sometimes that antagonistic response to it can be a challenge for us to be forceful or zealous in that endeavor. But notice what Jesus says about this. Notice what he said to the apostles when he told them the inevitability of it. I love what he says here. It's amazing courage on their part. He said, whenever they persecute you, and they will, whenever they persecute you in one city, flee to the next. What was the purpose? To hide, to run away, to minimize, to make sure there's no more persecution for him in my life. No, recognizing while there's hostility here, go somewhere else and start the process all over again. In other words, their lives would be filled with this cycle. Going to some territory, being that cautious serpent but gentle as a dove, not wanting to cause any problems, but also wanting to bring the truth of the gospel. Finding some open ear, and then once they have the opening, freely sharing it, but then being totally exposed to the critics and the hostile individuals who are antagonistic against it, and being threatened, and then being told, okay, shake the dust off your feet if this is the case, and move on, and repeat the cycle all over again. And for me, sometimes I cringe, and I realize, I don't know if that's true. Sometimes it's almost as if once you have one taste of it in your mouth, the temptation is to guard ourselves, to protect ourselves from ever experiencing it ever again. Yet that was not the case for the apostles. It was, get out and go keep doing it, even at the risk of this continuing and going on. Notice in Matthew chapter 10 what he says about this in verse 24. He encourages us to realize that if this is how they treated Jesus, this is what is to be expected from us because of his will. In verse 24, he says, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master. It is enough for the disciple that he become like his teacher, and the slave like his master. If they have called the head of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign the members of his household? In other words, Jesus, even in his innocence, even in his desire to paint the message as positively as possible, with all of its blessings, he was hated, he was rejected, he was mistreated. And he says, expect the same if we follow him and seek to bring others to the light. As we continue on, notice another, again, kind of matter-of-fact kind of point about this is what we to expect. What will we expect aspect as we go from one town to the next, or one circumstance or one group of people to the next. Well, it says in Matthew chapter 10, verse 34 through 36, he says, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be the members of his household." In other words, you can't contain it. You can't hide from it. It is inevitable, at least for those who will follow the Master. As long as we continue being loyal to his direction, that's kind of par for the course. And the challenge for us, and as I look at what Jesus said to the apostles, it truly gives me a sense of admiration for them. I think about people like Paul, who he was stoned, left for dead in one city. Remember, he goes a couple of places over, and he goes back to the same city to encourage those disciples. And kind of following with that sense of it, he realized that persecution was on the horizon. Oftentimes, remember when there was the prophets who had warned what was going to happen to Paul as he got closer to Jerusalem. That the person who owns this belt, this is what's going to happen to him, bound him up, and realized he was going to be subject to some kind of hostility. And Paul essentially said, with much tribulation, we must enter the kingdom of God. This is inevitable. Paul accepted this. And all those who are loyal to the will of the Father and of Jesus have to accept this. But it's about how we handle it. That we must be resilient. Again, that's why the key is be innocent as doves. Do not shout back. Do not react in violence, and whether verbally or any other way. But to simply to show some dignity and show some honor and show some courage in how we respond to it. That really is the key. In other words, when we ask the question, well, why would we continue to be subjected to it? Why would he tell his disciples, and why would they blindly follow it and go ahead and go again and again and again into hostile territory and accept this persecution? Amazingly, what Jesus points to is there is some rhyme and reason to why he asks people to be subjected to it. What he says, and the beauty of this is in the powerful love and the courage of strength that comes in the gospel. And what he says is, when you stand before this and you are innocent and you are relying upon your Father in total courage and submission to him, those who are persecuting you are going to see it. They're going to be affected by it. And others are going to see your response. And it's going to trigger their interest. This is why Paul said it is only through tribulation we must enter the kingdom of God. And only through tribulation can we encourage other people to enter the kingdom of God. And thus, when we inevitably face and withstand the hostility against us, and do it in this courage and dependence on God, it's saying that there's something that we have that allows us to do that causes others to be curious about wanting to receive it themselves. And this is what he says about that in Matthew chapter 10, a few verses back, in verse 28. Let's just go back to verse 24. Matthew chapter 10, verse 24. Excuse me. He says, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master. It is enough for the disciple that he become like his teacher, and the slave like his master. If they have called the head of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign the members of his household? Therefore, do not fear them." There's a reason why over and over, remember what Jesus would tell the disciples, don't fear, don't be afraid. That sense of being courageous and withstanding the hostility in courage is a testimony of your faith in the substance of the message you're preaching. That's what gives it its foundation, its substance, its sense of validation, that this really means something. When you have that courage to withstand all the insults and all the mistreatment in love, that's what gets people interested in wondering about it. So notice what he says. He says in verse 26, "Do not fear them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. What I tell you in the darkness, speak in the light. And what you hear whispered in your ear, proclaim upon the housetops, do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul. But rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. We go and look at John chapter 16. This is essentially what Jesus said, kind of validating why he would be willing to suffer the horrific persecution. As we think about Jesus on the cross, and you think about them spitting on him, abusing him, making the crown of thorns, beating his head with the reed, blindfolding him, slapping him, asking, prophesy, who is the one who hit you? And he just takes it. He doesn't shout back. He doesn't insult back. He doesn't fight back. But he entrusts himself to his Father. And he says there's strength in that. And it sends a message that causes those who are actually inflicting the persecution to think about this scenario. It has power to do that. Notice what Jesus says in John chapter 16, beginning in verse 31. Jesus answered them and said, do you now believe? Behold, an hour is coming and has already come for you to be scattered each to his own home and to leave me alone. And yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. That's what Jesus was saying. The true testimony of the gospel that the Father is with you is ultimately seen with how you handle persecution. Your entrustment to the Lord, trusting, fearing him and not the man, not those who just can hurt and destroy the body. But notice what Jesus says about this. He says, I'm not alone because the Father is with me. These things I've spoken to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation. Here's the key. Take courage. This is the moment where Jesus is reiterating exactly what he said in Matthew chapter 10. If they treat me this way, they are going to treat you this way. And let us take note for why Jesus allowed it to happen and he submitted the way that he did. I have overcome the world. That is the message of the gospel. I don't need this world. I don't need anything here. I have a power that cannot be touched or seen. And it is so powerful that there's nothing in this world that's tangible that even equates to it. That's a powerful statement. A powerful way of demonstrating that. And notice, there were two individuals that we know of that were directly impacted by Jesus committing himself to the Father and letting them persecute him, who, as they watched how he died, became converted. One was a thief, who, as he watched the way that he suffered, it made an impact on him. Watching him suffer. Notice we turn to Mark chapter 15. In fact, Luke chapter 23 is the thief. Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 39. Notice what it says here. It says, in verse 39, one of the criminals who were hanged there was hurling abuse at him, saying, are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other answered, and rebuking him, said, do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. But notice, but this man has done nothing wrong, and yet he submits and depends and lets God carry him through it. It made an impact on him. In verse 42 it says, and he was saying, Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom. And he said to him, truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. Jesus' willingness to withstand it and say, I have overcome this because the Father is with me, made an impact. Another individual that made an impact was a soldier. In Mark chapter 15, a centurion. Roman soldier sees how Jesus withstands the persecution, and it impacted how he looked at the message. Notice what it says in Mark chapter 15 and verse 37. It says, and Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion, who was standing right in front of him, saw the way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. So it's the challenge for us, instead of tiptoeing around it and trying to prevent any sense of persecution ever coming our way, we must allow it to have its effect. And then how we respond to those treatments gives legs to the message we're trying to get them to respond to. It's what actually is the substance and the bedrock that creates some sense of faith in their part. And so this is why Jesus essentially was encouraging them to have that courage, depend upon God. And as we realize how difficult this is certainly not easy. And I can only imagine how beat down the disciples were and the apostles were, going from town to town and experience after experience and repeating the cycle. No wonder he says what he says in Matthew 10, verse 42. He says, "Whoever in the name of a disciple gives to one of these little ones even a cup of cold water to drink, truly I say to you, he shall not lose his reward." In other words, there is one of the great sources of hope and comfort we receive should be from our brethren. The one place we should always know, I can always come here, and should always have that sense, I know my brethren have my back. I don't know what I'm going through in my life, no matter what I've got going on, there are brethren that are there standing with some sense of encouragement, refreshment for me. Jesus said that is so vitally important, because little do we know how much hardship maybe one or two disciples may be having as they're faithfully sharing the message with co-workers or with family members or with neighbors. And little do we know, perhaps the sense of obstruction, the sense of viciousness maybe that comes at them, and yet they continue to share the message. If we're all seeking to do that, we're going to come here beat down, discouraged, hence with the need for all of us to be uplifting each other, giving each other a sense of refreshment. And he says how beautiful that is when brethren do that for one another, because we're not going to get that from people in the world. People are not going to be sympathetic to us at all. The only sympathy anybody has any hope of getting when they're going out in the world again and again and again, facing it the way the disciples did, is other sympathetic disciples who will encourage them. And so let us always be willing to provide that when we come together and utilize that. What a beautiful thing it is for us to be together. To say this is for us to refresh one another, not beat each other down, not tear each other down, but to give us that sense of safety and encouragement so that we will have the courage to go right back out into the world in a hostile environment and to be sheep in the midst of wolves. But Jesus says the only way that those disciples had the fortitude to keep being sheep in the midst of wolves is they could depend on faithful disciples who would see them day in and day out suffering. Say, come here. Let me take care of you. Let me give you something cool to drink. Sure, you've had a rough time. And just as we talked about in our lesson this morning, certainly not a place for us to be hypercritical of each other, hyper-condemning, but seeking to be patient, long-suffering. Yes, admonishing when we need to be admonished, but hopefully providing that safe place of admonishment and refreshing so that we can have the courage to go out into that world and preach the gospel. So we encourage each other to let's continue to do that. Let's have that courage. Let's depend upon the Lord, and let's be refreshing, encouraging to one another that we might have the courage to keep doing it. And we invite anyone who's with us who's never obeyed the gospel, that you might recognize truly the blessing of all of these individuals who were suffered so horribly to make sure that the message continually got preached. I just want to read something that always gets to me when I think about what people were willing to go through for their faith, for their confidence that the message of God was true, that it was valid, that it was worth whatever sacrifice someone might have to go through. I think of what we read in Hebrews chapter 11. Here, the Hebrew writer talks about the faith that the individuals had. And he specifically talks about the faith of individuals who carried on the message and faced horrible consequences because of it. Note verse 33 of Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11:33, he says, "Who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they might obtain a better resurrection. They believed in the message of God, and they were willing to suffer horribly because of it. Verse 39, or verse 36, others experienced mockings and scourgings. Yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. I have a hard time even reading that. Sawn in two. They were tempted. They were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. They did all this in one word, courageously, victoriously, in faith. In verse 39, all of these having gained approval through their faith. And they didn't even receive the full extent of the promises that we're entitled to. So again, as I go back to that image, certainly had to have been something so convincing, so thoroughly dependable, that they would allow themselves to be treated this way just for their faith, to keep bringing that message out and for others to hear it. We would simply plead with anyone who's yet to take advantage of the gospel to realize what extent of sacrifice has already been made on your behalf, especially the one that Jesus went through to make sure that your sins can be forgiven, to make sure that you can be a partaker of this, the blessings of being a disciple of Jesus. So we encourage you, if you've never obeyed the gospel, that you would repent this very evening, confessing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, being buried in baptism for forgiveness of sins. We would gladly help and encourage you to do that and have that sense of victory that Jesus assures we will have as we follow him all the way. Won't you come and obey the gospel while we stand and sing the psalm of encouragement together?